Good morning, everyone. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about scientists, and I'm going to split my presentation into two parts. The first part will be about the role of scientists in helping the world to fight against the coronavirus. And the second part will be about what type of person chooses to be a scientist. Now, that word scientist covers lots of different jobs. The ones on the slide are only a few of those jobs. So I'm only going to talk about the type of scientists who work on finding new medicines to treat different illnesses, and the scientists who make sure that the medicines that we take work and are safe for our bodies. There are lots and lots of long names for science jobs, which you don't need to worry about, but I've put them on as some of the older children might just like to see some examples. Now, over the last year, scientists from all around the world have been working together to find a way to try and protect us against getting the coronavirus. And they're trying to do that by making something called a vaccine. But what is a vaccine, and how does a vaccine work? I'm sure that most of you already know that germs, like the ones that cause sore throats and the flu, can make you feel unwell. You might get a runny nose, you might not feel like playing with your toys or going out to play football, but most of the time you get better quite quickly. But there are some germs, like the coronavirus, which is a type of germ called a virus, which can make some people really, really unwell. And it's a tiny germ, a really, really tiny germ that scientists can only see by using a microscope, which is really just like a giant magnifying glass that makes things look much, much bigger. And this is what the coronavirus looks like under a microscope. The doctors and nurses and scientists needed to find out what the coronavirus looked like first. And once they'd found out what it looked like, it allowed them to work together to find a way to protect people from the coronavirus, because what they're trying to do is to make less people really sick and not have to go to hospital with it. It was really, really tricky for the scientists at first. The only thing they were given was a problem, which is how can we protect people from all over the world from the coronavirus? So they had to use their curiosity to find out how the coronavirus worked, why it made people sick, and how it made people sick. Then the scientists did loads and loads of different experiments to find out how can a person's body be trained to fight against the coronavirus so that it doesn't make them ill in the first place. So the scientists all came up with ideas from their experiments, and they'd meet up to share their ideas with other scientists from all over the world to come up with an answer. So it was really just like a giant assembly for scientists. They had to have a really good growth mindset, though, when they were trying to find an answer to the problem, because every time something in their experiment didn't work, they had to show resilience. They had to keep going. They had to do new experiments. They had to talk about different ideas, and they just had to stick at it. And because of this resilience to keep going and keep going to try again, they had to do that because the world was depending on them to find something that would help people stop getting so sick. So they really couldn't give up. Good news though, eventually at the end of last year, the news reporters told the world that teams of scientists had made something called a vaccine to help protect us against the coronavirus. So thankfully, we now have a vaccine for coronavirus. In fact, there are now 3 vaccines, and there might even be more made by the end of the year. But what is actually in the vaccine, and how does it stop people getting ill? Well, first of all, a vaccine is something that is given to people to stop them getting an illness. Most of you will have had vaccines when you were babies to stop you getting diseases like the measles and the mumps. And some of your mums and dads or grandmas and granddads may have had the flu vaccine recently to stop them getting ill with the flu. When you get an injection, is our injection, with a vaccine in it, it is called a vaccination. Normally, if a germ, like the coronavirus, comes into your body, it acts like the bad guy and it will make you sick. So the coronavirus, this little naughty one here, can give people a high temperature, which is why your temperature is checked every morning before you come into school. Some people get a nasty cough or some aches and pains. And what happens is your body, if this bad guy gets in, eventually your body will recognize this bad virus and will make a team of good guys. Your body makes this team of good guys called antibodies. And they're really, really helpful because they will then attack that coronavirus and they will kill it. And then you will get better from your illness. Now, most vaccines are a liquid. So you can see there's a liquid in here that usually contains a part of the bad germ or something that's similar or will make something similar to the bad germ and will trick your body into thinking that there is a bad germ or a virus in your body. But the vaccination or this injection won't actually make you sick because this vaccine, what's inside here is really, really clever. And it will push your body to think that there's a bad guy in there. And so it will make lots and lots of good antibodies without you actually having the illness. Your body then is really clever and becomes well trained. And if something like the coronavirus or the flu comes into your body again, then you have these army of antibodies. They're already waiting to fight off things like the coronavirus, and they'll whiz around in our blood and they'll attack it and kill it before it can make you sick. Pretty neat. So who will get the coronavirus vaccine? Well, the coronavirus vaccine has only just started to be given to people over the last few weeks. The people that are being given the vaccine are currently elderly people, like your grandmas and granddads, who can get really sick and unwell with the coronavirus. So we have to make sure that they're protected first by the vaccine so they can build up all those good antibodies so that if the coronavirus gets into their body, it won't harm them. The other people that have been getting the vaccine recently are people that help others that are sick with lots of other diseases and illnesses. So not just people that have got coronavirus. And these people have jobs like doctors and nurses and care workers or ambulance drivers. So some of your mums and dads might already have had their vaccine so that they can do their jobs safely without worrying about catching the coronavirus. If you do know somebody in your family who's going to get the vaccine soon, then it really is nothing to be scared of, so don't worry. The vaccine, so that injection will just go into their arm and they won't feel it. They'll probably feel like someone has just given them a pinch on the arm. But you don't need to worry about what it feels like though, as most children won't be given the vaccine. So you can breathe a big sigh of relief. But even if you did have to have it, it really, really is a good thing to have. But what type of person decides to be a scientist like the ones that have made the coronavirus vaccine in the first place? Well, some people used to think you could only be a scientist if you looked like this. But in fact, when you grow up, any single one of you watching this assembly might become a scientist when you're older. You might just not know it yet. Most of you have probably got no idea what you want to do when you're grown up, which is absolutely fine, and it's no different to nearly all of the other children that are your age. When I was at primary school, just like you, and people asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, I really didn't know. I had no idea. I certainly didn't know that I wanted to be a scientist. Some days I'd just brush my dolls, play with my doll's hair, and think I'd become a hairdresser. Other days I'd dance around the kitchen and pester my mum for some ruby red slippers so that I could visit the Wizard of Oz. But most of the time, all I wanted to do was ride my bike and go walking by the seaside or go for a swim in the sea. Then, when I was in year 6, I went on a school trip to see a film. As we didn't have a TV at school, there was definitely no Netflix, there was no YouTube, and there was no Sky. So we had to go to the cinema to watch films, and I went to see one about a nature film. And the nature film was about some scientists called biologists who worked with animals like giant tortoises that could live to 100 years old and funny birds with blue feet, which I found fascinating. And I couldn't wait to get home to tell my mum and dad about it. Then, about a year later, I got a chemistry kit and it looked exactly like this. And I had loads and loads of fun things in it. So I could do experiments in my garage with my dad, as we didn't have a lab at school. So my dad took me into the garage and we used to make up, there was a little book that went with this. We used to make up lots of little different experiments. Chemistry sets you get now really won't look like this. They won't have as many chemicals in there and they're much safer. So you won't be able to blow your garage up, which luckily I never did either. Then I got a microscope for Christmas. And that's when I started to think about becoming a scientist. So I worked really hard at school and I went to university to become a scientist called a biochemist. So another funny word. When I was at school, though, some people told me to do something else. As they said, becoming a scientist would be too hard. And some people at the time said that girls couldn't become scientists, which I never believed. So I chose to ignore the people that tried to put me off, and I persevered as I really loved learning about biology and chemistry and wanted to do something I enjoyed and interested me. So I used my self-belief and courage to do what I wanted to do. When I was at university, I used my curiosity to ask questions and explore and discover new things. And I loved learning, so I learned with enthusiasm. And I took a risk. I did something that some people thought I wouldn't be able to do. So before I became a science teacher, I worked in a hospital lab and I did something called research, which is finding things out. And I did lots of different experiments as well and worked with the doctors to find out what was wrong with sick people. But then I got a job as a clinical safety scientist and did something called pharmacovigilance, which is a really tricky word alert. And I wonder how many of you can say that. And that word pharmacovigilance just means the safety of medicines. I'd spend my time working actually in these buildings with other scientists all around the world to test new medicines on thousands of people called clinical trials to find out if the medicines were safe and if they worked. And this is exactly what the scientists working on the coronavirus vaccine will have been doing for almost a year, which is really quick because most new medicines take a lot longer to make. And some of the medicines I worked on would take 4 or 5 years for us to get them into a patient. But it's because the scientists, they've done it really quickly because they've all worked together in a big team. And when I worked as a scientist, I always worked in a team. There were lots of people to talk to, lots of people to share ideas with. And that's why when you're in your science lessons, you get encouraged to share your equipment and talk about what you're finding out, because that is what real scientists do. When we were making and testing the medicines, once we'd done them and tested them and we knew they worked in the patients, we then carried on and we checked them forever. So we used to get lots of information. We used to do lots of graphs. We used to do lots of maths on them. And we used to make sure that we checked to make sure that those medicines were safe for as long as the doctors and nurses needed to give them to their patients. So on the news, when the newsreaders say that the coronavirus vaccine works to protect most people from COVID and that on most people it is safe and has been tested really thoroughly, then I can honestly say that it is true, because when I worked in medicine safety, we would only say that a medicine or vaccine was safe if it really was. So to round up, the scientists have done a brilliant job at finding a vaccine for the coronavirus so quickly. They came up with a problem in just under a year, when usually these type of experiments take a lot longer. The vaccine that the clever coronavirus scientists have made works in most people and is safe for most people. So if you know someone who's going to have the vaccination, it is nothing to be scared of. It really is an amazing injection for those people to be able to have. And remember, one day when you're older, any one of you may decide to become a scientist, And someone in this assembly might even become a scientist that finds out how to treat new diseases and illnesses to make sick people better. So I'm going to say bye for now and hand back over to Mr. Barber.